Welcome to Lesson 2 in Module 6 on ecosystems. This video is going to concentrate on biomass transfers through the ecosystem, and all the information that you need to back up what we're going through on this video can be found on pages 608 to 613 in your textbook. We're going to start with reminding ourselves about food chains and food webs. In your workbook on page 4 you've got this food web, and what we're just going to do is quickly run through the main features, which will just remind you of the stuff you would have done at GCSE. So all food chains and food webs begin with plants, which are our producers, and the plants are then eaten by the primary consumers, and the primary consumers are then eaten by the secondary consumers. And you can see that each of these organisms occupy what we call a trophic level, and a trophic level is really a position within the food chain. And you can see certain types of organisms here might occupy more than one trophic level. So for example, we can see that the insectivorous birds are occupying more than one level in that food chain. And so the way that these food chains interact, we end up with food webs. And then from this, what we can see is that organisms are then not relying upon just one type of food. That, you know, most things will eat more than one organism or more than one type of plant, and this then obviously makes the food web a lot more stable, because if any of those individuals disappear or numbers decline, it means that all the other things in the food web, although the numbers will adjust, will be able to survive because they'll probably be able to eat something else. So for example, if we look at the hawks and the owls, they're eating lots of different types of organisms, and they don't totally rely upon one thing. If you eat just one thing and that one thing disappears, then clearly you could be in a lot of trouble. So on that diagram you can see that the toads don't seem to have a lot of different things to eat, so potentially the toads could be more vulnerable to changes in that ecosystem. So in your workbook on page 4, I want you just to go through and answer the questions that are in the book. So using the food web, identify a producer, a primary consumer, an organism that occupies more than one trophic level, and which group of organisms are missing from this food web. Now all food webs actually end with a group of organisms which are going to dispose of them when they are finally dead. So we don't put them into our food webs most of the time, but they would actually play a part in every level, and hopefully from that you can understand that this is the group of decomposers. So the objective of this lesson is to talk about energy and biomass transfers. So we're going to describe how biomass is transferred through the ecosystem, outline how biomass transfers between trophic levels can be measured, and discuss the efficiency of biomass transfers between the trophic levels. The information in food chains can be displayed in a variety of ways, and one of these is by using pyramids of number. So what we can see here is we can see that we have the number of producers at the bottom of the pyramid, then we have our primary consumers on the next level up, and then above them the secondary consumers, and then the tertiary consumers, and of course if we've got another layer we could have the quaternary consumers and so on. The other thing to remember is that we refer to each of the layers in this pyramid as trophic levels, and the producers are always the first trophic level, and so on further up. It's important to remember that when we're displaying information as pyramids of number, that they're always arranged in this order. The producers have to be at the bottom and the top carnivore has to be at the top. Here's an example of a pyramid of number where we've got grass at the bottom with rabbits as our second trophic level, and those are being predated by foxes above. And you can see some idea of the sort of numbers that we might be looking at. Of course, what this doesn't tell us is the time scale that these numbers would operate in. And here we have an example of another pyramid of number. So this is where pyramids of number don't really work. we can see our food chain starts with an oak tree, then we have a large number of insects living on that oak tree, and then a smaller number of birds such as a woodpecker that eat the insects. Now this obviously is a problem because the oak tree is a really large organism but actually still counts as just one organism. And so in this case the pyramid of number doesn't look right because pyramids of number don't take into account the size of the organism. Here's another example. So just mentally sketch this pyramid of number that you would expect for this food chain. So we've got a large number of seeds which are being eaten by a certain number of birds, and those birds are being killed and eaten by a cat, and then living on that cat is some fleas. So we would have a large number of seeds, we'd have a smaller number of birds that eat those seeds, probably one cat that might eat those birds, and then living on that cat is a large number of fleas. So again, this same problem applies. It's the main reason why pyramids of number tend to work is because, generally speaking, as you move up a food chain, the organisms themselves get fewer in number, but they become bigger in size. So there will always be fewer of them, but there would be fewer of them anyway because of the way that energy is transferred through that food chain, but the increased size of those organisms contributes to that issue. So, one alternative is to consider biomass rather than numbers. So biomass is the mass of biological material, which is really just what it sounds like. So rather than having one oak tree, if we could actually weigh that oak tree and all the biological material in it, that would give us a different number. So biomass can be fresh or dry. So if it's fresh, it means that you just pick it and just weigh it, and dry it means that you have dehydrated all the biomass, and then you can weigh it. If you measure the biomass of plants, it should also include their roots. Most people forget about the roots because they only really think about the leaves and so on that are actually being consumed. But not all organisms just eat the leaves. Some organisms do eat bark and roots and so on. Units often include the area that the biomass is produced in. And the biomass is going to be the source of energy that passes through that ecosystem. Just on the right there, you've got some pictures of examples of the sorts of biomass that we tend to make use of. So one solution to the way of demonstrating the number and the biomass is to display this data as a pyramid of biomass. So in this instance, we take into account their size as well as the number of the organisms in that food chain. We've got an example here of grass, which is eaten by grasshoppers, and then we've got kookaburras, which is a type of bird from Australia. So you can just see here that the units include the mass and also the area with which they that these things have been measured in. So really what we would say is that within a metre squared you would expect to find 400 grams of grass. So there are some limitations to using pyramids of biomass. We've got our numbers of organisms there. So we've got one oak tree, we've got 10,000 aphids, and we've got 200 ladybirds, and we've got their biomass as well. So we need to measure the biomass and multiply that up by the number that we've got. And you can see here that on the left, this would be the pyramid of numbers produced from that particular food chain. But here, once we put the biomass in, we could start to get a pyramid that looks a little bit more like we'd expect it to, because it now indicates that even though there's only one tree, there's a lot of biomass involved in that tree. So there are some problems though with pyramids of biomass. The problem we mainly have with this is that the biomass can vary throughout the seasons. So for example, if we were measuring the biomass of that oak tree in the winter, it would be a lot less than the biomass of that tree in the summer, because obviously in the summer the oak tree has leaves, but it doesn't have leaves in the winter. So most of our data then is going to be fairly seasonal. So if I was to do that pyramid of biomass and collect my data in the winter, I wouldn't get a particularly accurate picture. So measurements should be averaged over the year to get a full picture. Biomass can also be very rapidly produced and consumed, so it will never look like there's very much there, because it never gets a chance to accumulate. But if you were to, for example, take a field and just as a snapshot in time measure the amount of biomass as grass, it would look like there wasn't very much there. But if I had taken away the grazing animals and just measured the grass as it grew, I would be able to get a much better picture of the mass of grass that was being produced. So a very high reproduction rate will often be hidden by the fact that it's being consumed just as quickly as it's being produced. So that can be misleading. And then you can end up with pyramids which again are unbalanced. So with this in mind, you can now work through exam question 4 on page 14 of your workbook. The final way of representing our food chain is in a pyramid of energy. So the example we have here is we've got grass eaten by the snowshoe hare, which is eaten by the red fox, which is eaten by the wolf. And you can see at the top there, in the top right hand corner, it tells you that the units used here should include the energy for a given area and a set amount of time. So they tend to be in kilojoules per metre squared per year. In this one we haven't included any timescales, but you do often find there's timescales in the calculations. So in order to actually work this out, you would need to work out how much energy is contained within each level of the food chain, so really within the biomass of each of those organisms. So in order to do that, we would need to use a bomb calorimeter, and that allows you to find out the energy content in joules or kilojoules per gram of dry biomass. Like all of these methods, there are limitations. One of the main ones is that it's a snapshot of the ecosystem at any moment in time, and it won't necessarily reflect any seasonal variations. And this can lead to a distorted idea of how the energy is being transferred, because populations can obviously vary quite a lot in those timescales. I mentioned a piece of equipment called a bomb calorimeter, so I just thought I would just quickly go through this. There is a picture of one of these pieces of equipment in your workbook. So what we can see is it's a very simple piece of equipment. We have a chamber in the middle there, which is it's called the sealed bomb. And the sealed bomb is where you put the sample with the food or the organism in it that you're going to investigate. And sitting around that sealed bomb chamber is a large amount of water, and this is all contained within an insulated capsule around the whole thing. And we've got a few things here to make the whole process a bit more efficient. There's a stirrer to make sure that the water moves around so that the water is heated inside this chamber evenly. And then you've got a thermometer to detect the change in temperature, and we've got these things called ignition wires, and those ignition wires will set fire to the sample. So the first thing you need to do is you need to make sure that the biomass is dry so that it can be burnt. If it's fresh biomass, it won't burn. Ignition wires set fire to the sample. The water temperature is measured at the start and at the end. And then the energy transfer is calculated using the formula which I suspect many of you will remember from your physics GCSE. And this is the mass of water times the temperature change times the specific heat capacity of water. And that will give us the energy that has been transferred. And in order to make sure that we're getting a representative piece of data, we need to make sure that we use more than one sample for an organism, because it depends on which bit of the organism we sample as what the outcome will be. So for example, you would expect fatty tissue to have a higher energy content than, for example, bone tissue. So it's very important to get a whole picture of the organism is to take a variety of different samples and use that information to come up with an overall energy content of each trophic level. Now obviously this is quite an invasive procedure. Obviously it doesn't matter too much when you do this with plants, but to actually know the energy content of each organism at each trophic level involves killing the organism, which in itself is obviously not desirable, especially if we're talking about endangered species. So this is perhaps not as used as often as you might think. So when we've got this information, we will then end up with a pyramid of energy flow. And you can see here, this is shown quite nicely with the phytoplankton, which is the type of plants that you perhaps get in a sea or a lake. And these are then eaten by other smaller organisms, which are more of an animal nature, which are the zooplankton, which are then eaten by small fish and large fish. And as we say, we can calculate this for kilojoules per given area over a period of time. So when we're looking at how energy and materials flow through the ecosystem, we can see that matter is constantly being recycled within that ecosystem, and this includes the nutrient cycles such as the nitrogen and carbon cycles and the water cycles. So these would be any abiotic elements that we might be thinking about, and these ones are going to be recycled throughout the time in the ecosystem. However, energy is not recycled. Energy enters that ecosystem as light energy, which is captured by plants in photosynthesis, and that is then harnessed in biological or organic molecules and creates the biotic element. And these are then converted into tissues and materials for the organism to grow. And then eventually that energy will be released, and it will either be captured in terms of those biological molecules, which are then transferred to the next trophic level, or if they can't be, they will then be broken down, and the energy contained within those bonds is going to be released as heat energy. And it is a fairly inefficient process in the way that materials are transferred through, and any energy that is required by that organism, some of which will be converted into ATP, but some of it will be lost because it's an inefficient process. So that sort of comes back to a little bit, which we'll be doing later on in respiration in September. So when we think about energy efficiency calculations, it's like any efficiency calculation. The energy efficiency is calculated by the energy transferred to the next level divided by the energy in the previous level. So if we were thinking about our food chain, we might say the energy in our primary consumer divided by the energy in our producer times 100, and that will be the efficiency of our energy transfer. So in this instance here, we've got producers, and producers are, if you add up how much energy is in those producers, they would have started with 4,000 kilojoules, of which only 400 kilojoules have gone to the primary consumers. The primary consumers, on the other hand, have only passed 75 kilojoules to the secondary consumers, and 425 kilojoules have been lost. And all of those losses are going into the environment either as waste materials and also in terms of things that are not going to be eaten. So we'll have a look at that in just a second. So what I would like you to do in your workbook, you have this chart. I'd like you to work out the efficiency of energy transfers between each trophic level in the given food chain. So if we start at the very beginning, all of the energy that gets passed on to the food chains originally comes from sunlight, as you know. So this is in the form of energy which is captured by photosynthesis. There was a study at Silver Springs in the USA which measured this. So you can see here we've got a very big number of kilojoules per metre squared per year of solar energy landing on the plants. And from that, a much smaller number, 87,110 kilojoules per metre squared per year, is being captured and fixed during photosynthesis. None of the rest of it is. So the efficiency of energy transfer from the sunlight onto the leaf is relatively low. It's about 1.2% based on this particular calculation, depending upon obviously which type of plants we're dealing with. So this is relatively poor, and very little light energy is actually really getting captured by the leaves. And we can explain this in a number of ways. One of the reasons for this is because a lot of the light which is landing on the leaves is actually not useful for the leaf. Only a relatively small number of wavelengths of light are actually going to be absorbed by the leaf, and all the rest of them are going to be reflected. So obviously the green colour of the leaf is to do with the green light being reflected. But that's the visible wavelength. There are a lot of other wavelengths of light which actually aren't being used by the leaf at all. So lots of UV and infrared and all the other wavelengths. So those are not being absorbed by the leaf at all. Only a relatively small proportion of visible light is actually being absorbed by the leaf, mostly in the red and the blue parts of the spectrum. Some of the light that does hit the leaf, which could be used, won't hit a chloroplast. So if it doesn't hit a chloroplast, it's not going to be absorbed. So those bits of light will pass straight through the leaf, and that will then be possibly hitting the leaves below. After all, plants have layers of leaves, and there is a purpose to that, because of course it's important that light goes through the leaf to the leaves below, otherwise there would be no point in having anything other than one single layer of leaves on the outside of the tree. So light can pass through the leaf and it will hit the leaves below, and hopefully then some of that light will hit a chloroplast. And some of the light, of course, is being reflected off as well. So how is energy lost from the food web? So here we've got an example of a mouse, and the mouse, we're going to say in this instance, in this diagram, we're starting off with the mouse having eaten 100 kilojoules. So where is all this energy going if it doesn't make it into the mouse? So for every 100 kilojoules that this mouse consumes, 60 kilojoules is going to be wasted. So it will either be wasted because it's going to be lost in dead tissues, or maybe the food won't be digested. So it might eat 100 kilojoules, but actually quite a lot of that is going to pass through the mouse and is going to be contained within the feces. So for example, cellulose, which is very indigestible for most organisms, will pass through the mouse and will appear in the feces. Some material will be in urea, and urea contains a certain amount of energy, not a huge amount, but enough for it to start making a difference. And obviously any dead tissues that the organism itself, the mouse itself, is going to lose in that time. So 60 kilojoules is actually not obtained even at the beginning. 30 kilojoules is going to be converted into heat, and this is because when the mouse eats the food, a lot of the time that they eat the food, that energy from that food is the energy that's keeping the mouse alive. The mouse itself has to respire so that it can move about, it can hunt for food, it can digest the food, so it's spending quite a lot of that energy just keeping itself going. So if it's spending that energy to keep itself going, it can't then store any of that energy in terms of tissues in itself, and it's only the energy that is stored as tissues which becomes mouse, which can be eaten by the next trophic level. So what I want you to think about from this is when an organism eats food, what you're really talking about here is it's the profit which is edible by the next trophic level. So what I mean by this is, if you are an organism and you're very small and you never eat enough food to get any bigger in size, then you haven't got very much tissue to pass on to the next trophic level. So if you, on the other hand, eat enough food to grow bigger, that gain in mass is what is eaten by the next trophic level. So only 10 kilojoules of the original 100 is going to be available for growth, and that is the proportion that becomes new tissues, which is consumed by the next trophic level. It's a bit of a difficult concept, but it's a very important one to make sense of. We need to have a quick look at how the biomass transfers differ between trophic levels. So the efficiency between each trophic level depends upon the different food chains and also the trophic level that we're dealing with. So it could depend upon how well the materials can be digested. So this is an important point, because plant material is actually quite indigestible by most organisms. It has a large quantity of cellulose, and animals don't contain the enzyme cellulase in order to digest it. Bacteria do have it, and so quite a few herbivores will actually contain those bacteria in their stomach so that they can benefit from the digestive process of those bacteria. So that's how cows operate. But lots of other animals don't have these bacteria, so therefore plant material is relatively indigestible and low value nutritionally, which is one of the reasons why when people eat plants, vegetables and so on, generally speaking, we're encouraged to eat lots of vegetables because it bulks out the waste, and it also is relatively low in calories, and therefore you can eat more of them. So they are relatively low energy compounds, and this is basically to do with the amount of cellulose that you have in there. You only have to look at how much food a herbivore will eat in a day compared to a carnivore to get some feel for how there's different energy value of food. So I used to have a horse, and my horse would eat perhaps half a bale of hay a day easily, and in the winter even more than that. And he would spend most of his time eating, and most large herbivores do. They literally spend all their time eating. Whereas a carnivore, such as my dog, will have a very small meal once or twice a day, and will be a relatively small quantity of waste that's produced, whereas the horse would produce bucket loads of stuff. And that's because they don't digest it very well, so a lot of it comes out more or less similar to how it went in. And so the digestibility of the material will determine the efficiency of biomass transfers between trophic levels. Also, the energy requirements of the organism can make a difference as well. So, for example, surface area to volume ratios can play a big part, and I'll put this into the context of things like temperature. So if you are a small organism such as a mouse, quite a lot of the food that you take it in will be used in order to keep your body temperature up. If you are a homeotherm, a warm-blooded organism, you need to keep your body temperature constant, and so quite a lot of the energy is spent keeping your body temperature up. Now that applies to all homeotherms, but it applies particularly to small organisms like mice, because they have a relatively large surface area to volume ratio. The environmental temperature as also will make a difference. If you are a warm-blooded organism and you live in a cold environment, or an environment which has a tendency to get cold at different times of the year, you have the potential to lose a lot more heat. So you might need to eat a lot more food in order to maintain your body temperature, because you're using up a lot of that energy to keep warm. If you live in water, for example, generally speaking, water temperatures don't fluctuate very much, and most organisms that live in water are actually evolved to cope with that constant environmental temperature, so they don't spend very much energy on keeping their body temperature up. Even mammals, which are homeotherms that live in water, such as whales, they have other ways of keeping their body temperature constant. For example, having large amounts of subcutaneous fat, so that fat keeps their core temperature steady regardless, and in fact they have more problems keeping their temperature down if they come out of the water. Activity levels will also determine the transfers between them. So organisms like plants obviously don't expend energy moving, whereas animals that have to hunt will spend quite a lot of their time, a lot of their energy moving around, and so therefore the transfer is going to be less, because they're going to be using up more of their energy in order to keep themselves going and to sort of to power all their day-to-day activities. So less of the energy is available for the next trophic level, because they're basically using up a lot of it. If you're a plant, then you don't use up much energy in respiration, and you certainly don't keep yourself warm. So any energy that you have you've captured, most of it's available for the next trophic level. Unfortunately, the next trophic level is very bad at digesting plants, so the energy transfer is really down to the low digestibility of the plant. So let's just quickly have a look at how this affects the way in which the size of the food chain that we have. Now if we look at, we've got 3 food chains here. The first one has only got 2 trophic levels, the next has got 3, and the next has got 4. Now what we can see is that at every level we've got energy being transferred between each trophic level, and at every transfer point some of that energy isn't going to get to the next trophic level, simply because a lot of it will be wasted and won't be digested. If we look at a plant being eaten by a primary consumer, quite a lot of the plant material won't be eaten. So for example, the roots probably won't be eaten. If it's a woody tree, then the bark probably won't be eaten. So any of the energy contained within those less digestible parts of the plant are not available to the next trophic level. If you're looking at the example where we've got a consumer in the second of our models there, then things like fur and bones won't be eaten mostly by the consumers. So the carnivore, because they're usually very hard to digest. So there's quite a lot of material and energy that's contained within, and biomass that's contained within these inedible parts which are not passed to the next trophic level. So we've got this loss of biomass between each of these trophic level transfers, and so gradually what we can see is that biomass is being lost at every stage, and therefore if we look at how much land area you need in order to grow all of the producers, then it starts to become less efficient. So if we look at the first one, we can see that we've got a certain number of plants, and the number of plants that we've got there is much less than in the third diagram, and so therefore we don't need as much land to grow those plants to feed the top consumers. If we look at the third diagram there with the 4 trophic levels, we can see that we've got a large number of plants in order to support all the organisms that will support one of those top consumers. And so we need a lot more space and a lot more land, and you will therefore be able to feed relatively fewer on that same quantity of land. So if I scaled up my first diagram to have the same number of plants as my third diagram, I'd be feeding a lot more of my top consumers in that diagram. I hope I've made myself fairly clear with that one. So these pyramids of number illustrate the problem. The more trophic levels, the greater area required to input sufficient energy to supply the same number of apex consumers. That's why most sustainable food chains tend to work on about 3 trophic levels. They don't tend to go much higher than that. And if we were looking at sustainable farming, then actually what we really see is that if you live on a vegetable diet, you can feed more people than you can feed by eating a meat diet. And that is something that we see all the time around the world. If you look in some parts of the world where people are much poorer, they live most of their diet is plant-based. They eat very little meat, and which obviously can be a problem for people because protein is an important part of the diet, and you get a lot less protein from vegetable material than you do from getting it from meat. So what it means is that as some parts of the world become richer and they start to want to increase the amount of meat in their diet, we are going to have to manage this sustainably, because it's really not possible for everybody to eat a Western diet and to have the same quantity of meat. So basically what we all need to do is eat less meat in order to make it sustainable. And actually most medical studies show that Western diet contains. So as we look through energy losses in our food chains, we can see the sun, about 1 to 3% of the sun's energy is being picked up by the primary consumers, which is then passed on to the plant. Then the primary consumers are eating the producers. I don't really know why they called it primary producers, because it's just a producer. So primary consumers are eating the producers. Between 5 to 10% efficiency of transfer of that biomass. About 10% is the sort of normal marker, we would say. If you eat plant material, about 10% of that biomass makes it into the primary consumer. And as primary consumers are then eaten by secondary consumers, we have a higher transfer efficiency. Between 15 to 20% is passed to our secondary consumers, and same to our tertiary consumers. And this is really what I was saying about how meat is much more digestible, and therefore it gets passed on to the next trophic level more efficiently. And that is, it may sound like an argument for eating meat, but actually you've still had, in the early stages, you've still had the inefficiency of the producers into the primary consumers. So all we're doing is compounding that inefficiency with just another level of inefficiency, because you can't avoid that inefficiency between the producers and the primary consumers. And all of these organisms will gradually release the energy that is contained within this biomass as heat during respiration. Lastly, going back to right when we started this presentation, I mentioned about the level on the food chain that is missing, which is the decomposers and the detritivores, and these are the organisms which feed on feces and urine and dead animals. So most of that will be things like fungi and detritivores like flies, worms and so on, and then more finishing off the job is the bacteria, so the decomposers which really do get in there and break down those tissues right down to their sort of very basic molecules. And because they are breaking them down, using the materials and respiring themselves, they will also release a lot of that energy as heat eventually. So if you go to something like a compost heap where there's a lot of decomposition going on, and if you put your hand in the compost heap, you'll find it's really warm, and it's warm because that decomposing process is releasing heat. So if you dig up a compost heap in the middle of winter, it will start steaming because there's such a lot of heat inside there, that's all comes about from the decomposers doing their job and doing a brilliant job of recycling all those materials. So this brings us on to sort of like the last part of this talk, which is about productivity. Productivity is the rate at which energy passes through each trophic level per unit area, and usually about square metre, in a given amount of time. So we can actually measure how productive organisms. So primary productivity is the productivity of plants, it's our producers, and we can define this in a couple of ways. The first one is our gross primary productivity, GPP, and this is the rate at which plants convert their light energy into chemical energy. So that will be what's going on inside your chloroplasts. But then we also have net primary productivity, and this is the gross primary productivity minus the energy lost through respiration. So really we're saying we're not just interested in what the plant has captured in terms of energy. If they've had to use some of that energy to keep themselves alive, then we would describe that as the net primary productivity, and that's the most useful productivity because that's the energy which can be passed to the next trophic level. So this is the energy available for the herbivores. Now, farmers, of course, are always trying to increase the net primary productivity so that we get bigger yields, and there's a range of things obviously they can do to make that happen. So things like using fertilizers, watering the plants, having optimum temperatures if they're growing things in a greenhouse, for example, and using pesticides to reduce the amount of loss of the crop through things like fungi or insects that are eating the leaves, or slugs, that type of thing. So they can use pesticides and herbicides and so on in order to actually reduce the damage done by other organisms. Secondary productivity is the energy obtained by consumers. So this would be what the farmers would be considering if you were keeping chickens or pigs or something like that. So consumers are relatively inefficient at obtaining energy from producers, as we've said before, because as we know, they have to eat plant material, and so the plant material is relatively indigestible. So you could be feeding them quite a lot of material, and a lot of it won't become part of the organism themselves. And in some places we can't really grow plants that well, so humans would have to rely upon hunting the animals. So secondary productivity is an important thing because they might find that they actually cannot rely upon plant material as a source of food. Each animal is going to waste energy from indigestible materials, so not being able to eat all parts of the plant, so the cellulose, the fur, the bones, or the wood, or whatever it is that they're doing. But we can improve secondary productivity in a number of ways. Now this may not be very palatable for us, but this is a fact, and this is the way that farming operates. So factory farming of animals is going to focus on improving secondary productivity. One of the ways in which you can improve it is reduce the amount of movement, so the organism, whatever food they're using, they're not using up some of that energy walking around and wasting it. So you keep them in pens. If you keep them in sheds, less of the energy of the organism is being used to keep itself warm. And in fact, quite often, if you have some of these chicken sheds that people keep their battery chickens in, they actually have to introduce means of cooling down the sheds because they get so hot because of the amount of animals that are in there. You could actually introduce antibiotics into the food, and that reduces the spread of disease, because once you start crowding lots of animals into one place, if you get one animal that's unwell, that disease will spread really rapidly throughout the population. So antibiotics have routinely been fed to organisms in their feed, although I believe that is actually being banned now, so which is a good thing, because that obviously also spreads antibiotic resistance, which is passed up to us in the food chain. The farmer would also look at optimum feeding to reduce waste. So they would perhaps feed very highly digestible processed foods, which means that they don't produce a great deal of waste. And the only problem with that for the farmer is that obviously that those feeds are generally quite expensive. So this is a way that a farmer will improve their productivity to make more of their feed turn into pork, basically. This also brings us on to this idea that humans generally only eat producers or primary consumers. Now that's not exclusive, but in a sustainable way of eating food, we tend to focus on those two levels. And therefore that's because we're going to, as we know, between each trophic level we lose some biomass. So if we reduce the numbers of trophic levels in the food chain, we're going to be more productive. So if we decided that we were going to focus on eating animals which were, say, tertiary consumers, that food chain would be very difficult to sustain in the long term. So it's not something that's happened. And if you look at in the past, people who've been very rich, they tended to, there was a sort of a trend towards eating exotic animals, and the reason why is because those exotic animals were hard to get, they're few in number, and it wasn't something that the average person could do. So being able to dine on something unusual like golden eagles is something that perhaps only kings could do, because very few people would ever be able to access this as a sort of a regular food source. Not that I am aware that anybody does eat golden eagles, but if that was the case, then you can see why that would be. This brings me on to the idea of eating alternative sources of protein. And there has been a movement in recent years about eating insects. Now, insects are very often primary consumers, not always, but quite often, and therefore could be a valuable source of protein as a food source. And I found some of these images showing insects, particularly things like crickets and various different sort of mealworms and that type of thing, used as food sources. And actually there on the right you can see we've got something called Yora, which is a dog food which is being created using things like insects as a food source. I think the main reason for that is because there is a concern about the number of dogs in the world, and each of these dogs is obviously needing a meat-based diet, which is obviously can be quite a problem to supply. So I have to say, as much as I understand the theory behind this process, none of those things look particularly appetizing to me. And but having said that, if you look at the middle one at the bottom, this was a picture taken in a market in Asia where you can see that insects have been used as a regular food source. I can just see at the top of that picture something that looks very much like spiders, which I have to say doesn't look at all appealing, and looks like something that might feature on I'm a Celebrity. So I guess it's the way you've been brought up as to whether or not these things look like food or not. The one in the bottom left just looks like bugs, which I really don't think I could eat. But I know that in certain cultures these things are considered to be delicious and delicacies, and I think if you can get over the fact that you're eating an insect, I believe they taste quite nice. But it's just the idea of getting past it. And I know you can buy these things in England as well. It isn't possible to buy mealworms and crickets and so on. To me, they just look like pests that have got into my food, but I think that perhaps in the future we might need to be a little bit more flexible upon these things. And maybe if they didn't actually look like the organisms, maybe we'd be able to find it a bit more palatable. I know you can buy things like mealworm burgers and stuff, but I have to say I've never tried one.
So just summarising then, improving productivity. So on the left, primary productivity in plants and secondary productivity in animals. There's a whole list there of things that we can do. So for plants, increasing warmth and light intensity in greenhouse crops, early planting, giving longer growing seasons, irrigation or breeding in drought resistance, using fertilisers, crop rotation to increase the nitrogen level of the soil, nitrogen fixing crops to increase growth. So for example, every few years farmers in this area will grow a legume like peas, and that will they don't harvest the peas, they just plough them back in, and that increases the nitrogen in the soil. Use of pesticides and fungicides and herbicides, genetically modifying our crops, selectively breeding them so that they are more productive and produce less waste. All of those things are useful. Examples of that include things like wheat crops, which tend to have much shorter stems now than they used to, and that's to reduce the amount of energy that goes into growing long, tall stems. And also it reduces the possibility of the crop being blown over if you get wind in the summer. Secondary productivity in animals, as we mentioned before, eating animals before maturity. So most animals that are kept for meat don't usually live very long lives. Chickens, for example, tend to be eaten usually before they're 50 days old, which sounds really quite soon, doesn't it? They've only literally got to being a chicken and we eat them. Selective breeding, for example, increasing milk production. Use of antibiotics to reduce the energy spent on fighting diseases. Confining the animals to reduce their energy that's spent moving around and also keeping warm. So those are all examples of improving the productivity. So this brings me to the end of this presentation. So now you should be able to complete questions 1, 2, 3 and 5 in the workbook. You should already have completed question 4. So by the time we've completed this PowerPoint, you should now have done the first few questions in your workbook, as well as filled in the tables and the questions that accompanied the presentation that I've done. I hope that you found this accessible. If not, use your textbook to help you, and feel able to message me if you need a little bit more information. And I will see you soon. Thank you very much, everyone.